Hello, I hope you're doing well today. Way back when, last fall, when I started making my insanely long scroll that have brought so many of you here, I had actually intended that to be a sample for a 90-minute workshop that I had coming up on botanical embroidery, and I just kept having more and more and more ideas. Well, the workshop is almost here, and I realized I should probably make a more realistic sample of what people can expect to achieve in an hour and a half workshop. So that's what I'd like to share with you today, because I think that this will probably be a better tutorial for beginners and what they can expect to achieve in a reasonable amount of time. I'm going to be working on this small hexagon with some quilt batting on the back, because in my social stitching group we've been making small hexagons as a collaborative project, and here's one of the other ones that I've been working on, but you can really do this on any size. So the first step is to create a ground, something for our stitches to land on. And I'm going to do this using something called a whipped running stitch. I'm starting out with a running stitch, securing the thread in the back of my cloth, and I often secure the thread just by doing a few small stitches over top of each other, and usually 3 is enough to secure the thread without leaving a lump there. And then running stitch just is in out in a straight-ish line. You don't have to worry about this being perfectly straight, because the ground is never perfectly straight, especially if it's a natural ground material. And if you feel comfortable, you can take several stitches at once, or just go one at a time and go right across your piece, somewhere less than halfway up. And then when you get to the end, secure the thread and then come back up to the front. And this is the whipped part, because right now it's just a dashed line. So we're going to go back through all of those stitches. We're not going through the cloth, just looping the thread now around those stitches to create a more solid line. When you add this part to the running stitch, it's known as a whipped running stitch. And I'm going over and around and around and around. So I'm always going into the stitch from the left and coming out on the right, and then I'm going into the next stitch on the left. And you don't have to do it like that if you don't want to, but that's what I'm doing. There's still some thread on my needle, so we're going to use that to add some little tufts of grass using something called a straight stitch, which is the same as a single running stitch. You just come up and go back in, and then you come up somewhere else on your cloth and go back in. And I just finish up my thread doing these kinds of stitches across that ground or horizon line there. And now these tufts of grass are not going to be perfectly straight. Some of them will lean one way, some of them will lean the other way, some of them will be close together, some will be far apart. It's actually quite hard to randomly space things so that some things are close together, some things are far apart, some things can overlap, they can cross over each other. So often when I ask people in art class to do things randomly, things get evenly spaced. Oh, look, I've got a knot there. So if you're very careful, it's not really a knot, it's just the threads are twisted. So if you start from the bottom end of the loop, you can sometimes pull that out if you're very gentle with it. So I'll go back to stitching. Some of my stitches will be close together and some of them will be further apart. And just do that until you run out of thread, because why waste it? You've got it, and it'll add some interest to your piece. So now we're going to go into stems. We're going to start with what's called a back stitch to make a stem. And it starts out the same way as a running stitch. You start wherever you want your stitch to come out. You take one stitch in, out, and now instead of going forward, you'll go back and fill in that space between where your needle came out and the previous stitch. And then you'll come out again ahead of the previous stitch and then go back into that space. That's how the stitch goes. And this one as well, it does not have to be perfectly straight. Your stitches don't have to be even. You just come out ahead of the stitch before and go back into the space and then come out ahead. And that's called the back stitch for fairly obvious reasons, I think. And you'll just go up until you feel like you've gone far enough, but just be sure to leave some space above that stem for the flower that you're going to make. And then just go into the back there and secure the thread off. Again, I do the same thing as when I'm starting. Just a few stitches right over each other, and I always try to make a point of putting my needle back into the cloth so it doesn't go missing. And this time we're going to do another stitch, and I'm tying a knot this time just to mix things up. And this stitch is actually called a stem stitch. And if you look at the back of the running stitch, you'll notice that it looks different than the front. And this stem stitch is actually what the back side of the running stitch looks like. So what you do is you take a long-ish stitch and then forwards, and then you go back to the previous stitch. So you take a long stitch forward and then you go back to where the previous stitch came out. Take a long stitch past the end of the previous stitch and then back, forward and back, and you just keep going like this, and it creates a bulkier line than the running stitch does. It's not my favorite stitch because unless you're careful with the stitch, it can get sort of a little out of control, and the edges kind of don't go straight. They kind of stick out on either side. So now I just move my thread over and I'm going to do another one beside it. This one's going to be shorter. So in addition to not being perfectly straight, I also don't want these stems to all be the same length, because in nature things are varied. If you buy a bunch of plastic flowers, yes, they will all be very straight and very much the same length, but we're going for a natural look here, so things will all be different and a little bit imperfect and wonky. So I've got more thread here, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make another stem, but this one's going to cross over one of the previous stems, because things don't have to line up perfectly in rows. You can make as many stems as you like, and I thought 5 or 6 stems would be a good number, but in hindsight I'm thinking maybe that's too many. That stem's finished too. So I'm going to do one more different style of stem, and this one's going to be branch. So each of those previous stems, it was just one stalk going upwards. This time I'm going to start out the same way as the previous ones, and I'm going to do this one as a back stitch because I like it better than the stem stitch. And I'm going to start out the same way, going up in a fairly straight-ish direction, but not perfectly straight. And because this is going to branch out, I'm actually going to make a point of kind of leaning over in one direction. And then when I feel that that's long enough, I'll move over like I did before, but this next branch is going to come down and actually connect with the other branch that I just made, the other stem that I just made. So it'll be a branched stem with 2 branches. And because stems will be thicker as they get closer to the ground, I will continue the stitches all the way back to the ground. And that's another thing to keep in mind, is you can vary the thickness of your lines by varying either the type of thread that you use or the number of strands. Now, one thing that I realized is all of my little tufts and all of my stems and right at that horizontal line, the ground or the horizon. But that's not realistically how things look. In reality, things that are closer to you will continue on into that ground beyond that line. So I'm going to, now that I remember that, I'm going to go it back and extend some of those stems that I made so that they continue on into that ground that I have there. And that will read as a much more natural looking composition than what I had before. Things that are further away, that, if you're looking at a hill, things that start out behind the hill, they will look like they are coming up from the horizon. So I'm not going to worry about those other two pieces. And if I have time later, I can go in and extend those, but I'm not going to do that right now. What I am going to do is I'm going to create a few little straight stitches down in that ground area there to look like little tufts of grass, like there's something going on there, that it's not completely naked down there. And whenever I have a little bit of thread left on my needle, I'll just finish it off, especially if it's green. I'll finish it off by making some little tufts of grass down in that bottom area there if I have time. And again, during our workshop, that might not be something that we have time to do, but it's certainly something that people could do when they go home or after the class is over. So that's that next bit. Now I've got a little bit more depth and perspective going on. And now our next piece is we're going to start adding some flowers, and we're going to start out with something that's actually called a lazy daisy stitch. So it's a variation of a detached chain stitch. The way the chain stitch works is you come up on the front of your cloth, and then you go back right into the same hole that you came out of, and that creates a little loop, and you make sure that your needle is inside that loop, and then you make a little stitch that outside of the loop to secure that stitch. Let's do that again. So you come up on the front of your cloth and you go right back into that same hole, and then you come up through the loop, and then you make a little stitch that outside of the loop to secure that stitch, and then you come back in the center of your flower again, go back into the same spot, and it gets a little tough, so you might have to go back next to the same spot if it's getting hard to stick your needle through all those layers of thread. So then you keep doing this around in a circle, so into the same spot or close to the same spot that you came out of, through the loop, and then you make a small securing stitch just outside of the loop to hold that little loop in place. And now you can see as you're going around in a circle, it's creating a pretty generic flower shape, and that's what we call the lazy daisy. So one of these individual stitches is called a detached chain stitch, and when you create them in a grouping like this around in a circle, it's called a lazy daisy, and that's a perfectly good flower shape, embroidered flower shape. So because I chose to do this particular lazy daisy on that branched stem, I'm going to believe that the other flower in the same branch is going to look quite similar to the first one. So I'll do another one on the other branch of that stem there. And I don't know what kind of flowers these are, they're imaginary, but usually if the stems are attached to each other, the flowers look similar. Sometimes not. Sometimes you'll find flowers in different stages of growth. So some of them might be buds and some of them might be more mature, and they look different from each other. But in this case, they're going to look pretty much the same. They're both open, facing directly towards us, pink daisy-like flowers. And if you run out of thread in the middle off your lazy daisy, you just get some more thread of the similar color and keep going. So I'll continue this right around this flower here till I get back, till I feel like I've got enough petals on my flower. And if I look at it and think, oh, I left too much space back there. I can always go back and fill it in. You don't have to work systematically around your circle. You can always go back and fill things in if you want to, or jump back and forth. It doesn't really matter. No one's going to be marking you on precision and detail. So the piece of cloth that I'm working on is actually quite thin. So having that layer of batting at the back actually helps to keep the foundation from puckering up and wrinkling. Now we're going to use the same stitch, the same chain stitch, in a slightly different way. We're going to do what's called a long tail chain stitch, and we're going to make leaves with it. So I'm going to start that stitch away from my stem, and then I'm going to have the top of the loop also away from my stem. And now we were making really tiny securing stitches before, but this time we're going to make a really long securing stitch, and that's that stitch that's securing the loop there is what's going to attach that leaf to the stem. So the leaf has a little stem on it as well. So I'll do that a few times so you can get a really good idea of how that's going. And if you're not quite getting this, you can always just do a regular chain stitch where you come up right at the stem and then you make the loop going away from the stem, and I'll show you that in a minute as well. I'll do a few of these and I'll show you one where we'll start at the stem and then create the stitch going away from the stem. So here you go, I've come up right next to the stem, and I'm going to now make that loop leaning away from the stem, and then just take the regular short little securing stitch there. So that's a really sweet way to make leaves and petals, all using the chain stitch. So now I've still got some thread on my needle, so I'm going to go back down to that grassy area there and do some more straight stitches. And at first there's just a few there and it doesn't look very impressive, but the more you add, the more interesting this ground area is going to look and the more effective it's going to become. And you can certainly do this as a separate thing. Just load up your needle with some thread and do lots of straight stitches, and that's probably what I'll do in the end, again if we have time, but at this point, I'm just adding a few there to give you the idea, and then we'll go back later and add more in this area. And again, some of them are close together, some of them are further apart, some of them are actually connected to each other, and just vary those, move them around, vary the size. Some of them are slightly longer, some of them are slightly shorter, they're angling in different directions, just so that there's lots of variety there. And this always happens to me when my thread gets shorter, it always comes undone, and that's when I take it as time to stop. Now we're going to do a different chain stitch flower. Now I've changed the color off my thread, and we're going to do that long arm chain stitch that I showed you on the leaves. So I'm starting the stitch far away from the stems, and then I'm going to take that securing stitch, is going to attach that loop back to the stem of the flower there. Sorry about going out of frame there. And I'm just going to do that several times, and this is going to be sort of a tall rush-like flower. It kind of looks like an ear of grass, or perhaps what kind of flowers grow like this? What kind of yellow flowers grow like this? I'm thinking purple ones that I'm thinking of are lupins or foxgloves, pink foxgloves, flowers like that. Oh, I know. It could be snapdragon, Scotch broom. It could be a Scotch broom or forsythia, or there are all kinds of yellow flowers that grow in stalks like this. So if you know of any yellow flowers that grow in this sort of shape, let me know. So again, this is the long-tailed, long-armed chain stitch. And again, you could do this stitch using a regular chain stitch if you like, and it would just be more compact. You won't have that long skinny stick attaching it. You just have lots of petals. And wanted to offer this because flowers don't always grow like a daisy. And I really do apologize that I keep going out of frame here, but hopefully you get the idea of how these stitches come together. So the next thing I'm going to do, because I have a little bit of that yellow thread left, I'm going to make some centers for my daisies using what's called a French knot. And you can skip this if this feels like it's too hard for you. And basically what you do is you come up where you want the stitch to be, and then you wrap the thread around your needle, and then with those wraps around the needle, you put the needle back into that same hole, and you should have a knot. I'm going to do this again. And this time my knot got a little scruffy, so I'm just going to go back up, and I'm going to take a few stitches to clamp down those stray bits of thread. And I'm not going to worry about it too much. It does not have to be perfect, but like I said, if you don't feel like you want to do this stitch, then please feel free to skip it. And now on that long tufty grass like piece, pampas grass is another plant that grows like this. I'm going to create some leaves in a different way, and this is we're going to use a new stitch, and it's called a fly stitch, and it's a little bit similar to a chain stitch. And again, I apologize for getting out of frame. I think most of it will be in frame. So but instead of the two starting stitches being in the same place, they're spread open. So you come up in one place, you go down in another place a little bit further away, and then you come up between the two of those stitches. And when you stack those stitches one on top of each other, they look very much like a leaf. So let me do that again. So I start out with just a straight stitch, and then I come up to one side of that straight stitch, and then on the other side of the straight stitch, and then in between I catch the loop, and then I make a securing stitch to hold it in place, and then I come up on one side, go down on the other side, secure that loop, another stitch to secure that loop, and I do that 4 or 5 times to create a rather feathery looking leaf. And that creates a big leaf, but it's just another way to create a leaf. And now I think that this is about the point where we may be running out of time in the 90-minute workshop that I'll be doing, and my piece still looks unfinished, but this whole thing took me over an hour and a half. That's without stopping to explain to anybody, including fumbling with the threads falling off the needle and having to rethread the needle and choose new thread. So I think this is about as far as we're going to get. We're about 22 minutes into the video, and I can see this taking, close to an hour and a half, including some introductions. Now you can see that I've gone back here and I've filled in some of the areas that I thought needed to be filled in to create my leaf there. And now I'll do some more straight stitch grass. That's why I don't know how much time we're going to have to fill in the grass at the bottom. I think we may end up just doing a bit, and maybe I'll send people home with a needle and some thread so that they can work on it more on their own time. And that part is really easy. They don't need a lot of instructions. Now let's do some slightly differently shaped chain stitch flowers, and I'm sure that we're not going to have time to do this in class, but I do want to show people how to do this. But if you've done the lazy daisies, these ones will be easy. And it's basically just 2 petals side by side, leaning in different directions, and it looks like a little tulip or maybe a crocus or a little spring flower. So I'm just going to do lots of these down on the grassy area at the bottom here, just to bring some interest down there. And I've got a little bit of a lump there, but I'm not going to worry about it. I was able to pull that out gently. And that's usually what I find you can do is if you pull on that loop, that the twisted threads will come undone. Sometimes you have to pull up and other times you have to pull down, but that usually works if you do that gently. And so I'm going to create as many of these as I have thread for, just making 2 little detached chain stitches attached to each other at the point, and you can do 3 if you like, but 2 is a little bit faster, and I was thinking of time, and this is something that we will do in the class if we have time. But actually I think that what we'll do is there's still a few of those stems that need something attached to them. We'll probably do these shapes, these stitches on the stems, and I think I'm going to do that here as well. I'm not going to just do these little shapes down at the bottom. I'm going to do these flowers on the stems as well. And these also could be little leaves. If I'd done them in green, they could be little leaves, and they could have a little flower above them, maybe a French knot flower or something else. They could easily be that. That would be really cute, wouldn't it? So again, as randomly as I can, they're not lined up. Some of them are lower, some of them are higher. That creates a really natural look. I'm almost out of thread there, and that's when I know it'll be time to stop, because if I don't stop, yep, there you go. It came out of the needle, so I'll have to rethread the needle and go into the back. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create some interest in the top part of my piece, because all my flower stems were quite low down on the piece. I've ended up with this empty space at the top, and again, I apologize that a lot of these ended up being out of frame, but I think you'll see enough to give you the idea of how I'm creating this little flock of birds. And I'm just using a really thin sewing thread here because the birds are really far away, and that's something that I've noticed with a lot of stitchers, that they use the same thickness of thread for everything. So sometimes the things that are supposed to be far away look a little bit bulky. If you use a thinner thread, a thinner line weight, then that gives the viewer the clue that these things are further away than the things that are bulkier. So if you want your flowers to really stand out and be really close up, you could use 3 or 4 strands of thread so that they'll look like they're very close to you. And now, because I'm using very fine thread, those birds look like they're further away, and it's just the same fly stitch. And actually it might be easier to practice this fly stitch first before doing the stacked fly stitch to make the leaves. So the way that this fly stitch works is you come up with your needle, and then you take a stitch that's a little ways away from that stitch, and then you bring your needle up between those, and you catch the loose thread, the loop, and you take a small securing stitch. And that creates a very convincing looking bird flying through the sky there. And now finally I'm going to finish off those last 3 stems there with some more petals. Instead of introducing anything new at this point, I'm just going to do these with the same thing that I did down in the ground, even the same color, but because they are up on branches, I'm making them slightly bigger. They don't even look like they're the same stitch, but you could certainly do them in a different color. You could come up with some other kind of inventive way to make a different shape of flower, and I would encourage you to go and have a look at my stitch scroll that I made, where there are lots of examples of different ways that I made flowers. And there you go. And I'm looking at this thinking, oh, I could add so many more stitches, maybe another flower, maybe some more detail down in the grass there. But this is the way it is now, and it does not have to be perfect. It's perfectly imperfect. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye for now.